They say every love story is unique, but ours felt untouchable until it wasn't. For 7 years, James and I built a life most people envied. We laughed, we planned, and we dreamed of a future filled with family and happiness. But life has a way of testing even the strongest bonds. It started as a spark, something so small I thought I could ignore it. But one decision, one seemingly harmless idea, was all it took to unravel everything. Have you ever wondered how far you'd go to save something you're not even sure you've lost? Because that's where my story begins. From the very beginning, James and I were that couple, happy, supportive, and adored by everyone. 7 years together, 5 of those married. We'd built the kind of relationship that made others envious. We dreamed big, from traveling the world to raising a house full of 4 kids. Our weekends were spent laughing with family, planning our future, and marveling at how perfectly aligned our lives felt. But maybe, just maybe, that perfection was too good to be true. Funny how life can surprise you when you least expect it. James was the rock, and I was the dreamer. Together, we had mapped out every step of our lives. We'd talk for hours about the children we'd have, what their names might be, how they'd take after us. The thought of building a family with him felt like the next big adventure. Yet, even in the midst of this love, there were fleeting moments when I felt restless. Could anyone truly sustain this level of bliss forever? Or was something lurking beneath the surface? Our love felt bulletproof, and the support from both of our families only made it stronger. Holidays were a blur of laughter and shared meals, with everyone admiring the way we completed each other. But deep inside, I sometimes wondered if James and I had been too focused on being perfect. Had we left room for life's inevitable messiness? I didn't know then, but that question would haunt me soon enough. Looking back now, I wonder if the cracks were always there, too small to notice at first. James was everything I thought I'd ever need, but I couldn't shake this nagging feeling that something was missing. It wasn't dissatisfaction, it was curiosity, a silent voice whispering, questions I wasn't ready to answer. What happens when perfection meets reality? What happens when dreams change? It started out as something so innocent, so insignificant, that I barely noticed it at first. Marcos was the delivery guy who regularly stopped by my office. Polite, charming, and always with that easygoing smile that could light up any room. I'm not even sure when it began, but somewhere along the way I found myself looking forward to his visits more than I should have. It wasn't intentional, at least that's what I kept telling myself. But there was something about him that made me feel seen. Our conversations were always light, just small talk to pass the time. Yet, I started noticing details about him. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. The warmth in his voice when he asked about my day. I'd catch myself laughing at his jokes a little too easily, or lingering near the door when I knew he was due for a delivery. It was harmless, wasn't it? Just a little harmless attention from someone who wasn't James. But if it was so harmless, why did I feel a flutter of guilt? I'd go home at night and push the thoughts aside, convincing myself that it was nothing. James and I were solid. We had everything. But the truth was, Marcos reminded me of a version of myself I hadn't seen. In years, carefree, unguarded, curious. Was it wrong to crave that feeling, even just for a moment? Maybe. Probably. Still, I found myself wondering what it meant to feel this way when I already had so much. And yet, I couldn't stop myself from looking forward to the next delivery. The questions were starting to pile up, though I wasn't ready to face them. What was I doing? Why did it feel like a piece of me had been awakened, even though I wasn't looking for anything? These thoughts lingered, no matter how hard I tried to ignore them. But as I stood there, Watching Marcos walk out the door one afternoon, I realized something had shifted. A spark had been lit and I couldn't put it out. Not yet. The spark that Marcos ignited wouldn't go away, no matter how much I tried to brush it off. It wasn't about him specifically. It was about the feelings he stirred, ones I hadn't felt in years. One late night, as James slept beside me, I found myself spiraling down an internet rabbit hole. Articles about modern relationships, emotional connections, and even open marriages flashed across the screen. At first, I dismissed the idea as absurd. But the more I read, the more I began to wonder. Could this be the answer to the restlessness I couldn't shake? The idea of an open marriage felt both thrilling and terrifying. It wasn't something people like us, stable, traditional, would ever consider, right? But the more I thought about it, the more it seemed logical. I didn't want to lose James. I loved him deeply. But was it possible to love someone and still crave something else? I told myself this wasn't betrayal. It was exploration. Yet, even as I framed it as a way to strengthen our marriage, a voice in the back of my mind whispered that I was playing with fire. Eventually, the weight of my thoughts became too heavy to carry alone. Over dinner one night, I casually brought up an article I'd read about couples who opened their marriages. I tried to keep it light, like it was just a passing thought. But James's reaction was instant. His face fell, and I saw something in his eyes that broke my heart. Disbelief, maybe even hurt. "Why would you even bring that up?" he asked, his voice cold. I stammered through an explanation, saying it was just a hypothetical idea. But the silence that followed was deafening. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling and questioning everything. I'd opened Pandora's box, and there was no going back. James hadn't spoken much after our conversation, but the tension between us was palpable. Had I just planted the first seed of doubt in a marriage I had sworn to protect? And worse, had I just revealed something about myself that even I wasn't ready to face? The unease lingered, and I knew this was only the beginning. Days passed, but the weight of that conversation never left the room. James grew distant, retreating into himself in a way I hadn't seen before. I wanted to take it all back, to erase the words that had so clearly hurt him. But it was too late. The idea was out there now, impossible to ignore. Then, one evening, James surprised me. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his tone calm but guarded. I held my breath, not sure what to expect. "Maybe we should give it a try," he said, the words landing like a blow. At first, I thought I had misheard him. James, the man who valued stability and tradition, was now entertaining the idea of an open marriage. But as he laid out his thoughts, it became clear that this wasn't acceptance. It was his way of setting boundaries. "If this is what you want, there will be rules," he said, his voice steady but his eyes betraying a flicker of pain. The conditions were clear: honesty, communication, and most importantly, no crossing emotional lines. He agreed, but it felt like he was bracing himself for impact. That night, I couldn't sleep. James had given me something I wasn't even sure I wanted anymore, and it didn't feel like a win. It felt like a test. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, wondering if I'd made a mistake by pushing us down this path. The way James looked at me, like he didn't fully recognize the woman he'd married, cut deeper than I cared to admit. Still, there was a part of me that felt relief, even excitement. This was a chance to explore, to figure out what was missing. But at what cost? The next morning, James handed me a list of rules, his face unreadable. I couldn't tell if he was offering me freedom or drawing a line in the sand. Either way, I knew this wasn't something he wanted. It was something he was enduring for my sake. As I stared at the paper, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of something irreversible. This wasn't just a decision, it was a gamble. And deep down, I wasn't sure either of us was ready for what came. Next, the first time I met Marcos outside of work, it felt surreal, like stepping into a life that wasn't mine. I had convinced myself it was all just curiosity, harmless exploration. But as I sat across from him, laughing at a joke I barely heard, guilt began to creep in. James had agreed to this, hadn't he? Then why did I feel like I was doing something wrong? I told myself to relax, to enjoy the moment. Yet, even as I smiled, a knot of unease twisted tighter in my chest. Marcos was kind, attentive, and everything you'd expect from someone who'd unknowingly become the catalyst for so much change. But as the evening wore on, I found myself thinking about James, the way he'd looked at me the morning after we made the decision, his eyes heavy with doubt. I couldn't shake the thought that I was betraying not just him, but the version of myself I had always believed I was. By the time the evening ended, I felt more confused than ever. Was this freedom? Or was I just unraveling everything James and I had built? When I got home, James was waiting, his expression unreadable. I could feel the weight of his gaze as I sat down, trying to act normal. "How was it?" he asked, his voice steady but cold. I gave a vague answer, avoiding his eyes, but the tension between us was undeniable. In that moment, I realized something important. No matter how much we tried to frame this as a mutual decision, the rules and permissions didn't erase the emotional distance growing between us. And worse, I wasn't sure how to fix it. That night, I couldn't sleep. The guilt sat heavy on my chest, suffocating and relentless. I'd thought this would bring clarity, that it might even strengthen our marriage. But instead, it had opened a wound neither of us knew how to heal. James's trust was slipping away, and I could feel it. Deep down, I feared I'd started something I couldn't undo. And as much as I wanted to believe otherwise, part of me knew things would never be the same again. The cracks in our marriage, once small and barely noticeable, had now become impossible to ignore. James had changed, and so had I. Conversations became strained, filled with unspoken accusations and emotional landmines. He started questioning everything: where I was, who I was talking to, even my intentions. "This isn't about an open marriage anymore," he said one night, his voice heavy with frustration. "This is about trust." Those words hit harder than I expected because, deep down, I knew he was right. Whatever trust we once had was slipping through our fingers. I tried to convince myself that we could fix this, that we were just going through a rough patch. But James's distance grew. He started staying out later, throwing himself into work and avoiding the house. When we were together, his eyes held a coldness I had never seen before. He would bring up Marcos indirectly, his words laced with bitterness. "I hope he was worth it," he'd say, and I could feel the weight of his resentment crushing me. I wanted to tell him it wasn't about Marcos, but what could I say? The damage was done. One night, during yet another argument, James finally said the words I had been dreading. "I can't do this anymore." My heart sank as I realized we had reached the point of no return. He accused me of emotional infidelity, of betraying the foundation of our relationship. I tried to fight back, to remind him that he had agreed to this, that we both had. But the truth was, I couldn't argue against the hurt in his eyes. He wasn't just angry. He was broken. And so was I. The day he moved out was the hardest. Watching him pack his things, I felt the weight of every decision I had made, every word I had said. It was over. 7 years together, 5 years of marriage, gone. I wanted to beg him to stay, to tell him we could fix this, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. As the door closed behind him, I was left with nothing but silence and the realization that I had lost the one person who meant everything to me. A year passed, but the emptiness James left behind never did. The divorce had been final for months, but I still found myself replaying our last moments together, wondering if there was something I could have done differently. Then, out of nowhere, James called. His voice, calm yet familiar, stirred something I thought I had buried. "I was in the area," he said casually. "Thought we could grab a coffee." My heart raced, torn between excitement and hesitation. Why now? What did he want? Seeing him again felt like stepping into a memory. He looked the same, confident, put together, but there was a softness in his demeanor I hadn't seen before. We talked about everything and nothing, skirting around the subject of us. It was easier that way, safer. Still, I couldn't help but notice the small moments, the way his eyes lingered on mine a little too long, or how he smiled at a joke he would have once rolled his eyes at. Was this a new beginning or just closure disguised as hope? Our coffee meetups became more frequent, each one blurring the line between friends and something more. I couldn't tell if he missed me or was simply curious about the person I'd become. And then, one evening, he asked about my plans for the future. Kids, relationships, all the things we once dreamed about together. "I've thought about it," I admitted, my voice trembling, "but I can't imagine any of it with anyone else." It was an honest confession, one that hung in the air between us, waiting for him to respond. James didn't say much after that, just nodded thoughtfully. And though I didn't want to read too much into it, a part of me wondered if he felt the same. There was no talk of reconciliation, no promises of getting back together. But for the first time in a long time, there was something between us that felt hopeful. Maybe this was enough, or maybe it was just the start of something we weren't ready to name. Only time would tell.
Keep watching our stories by clicking on one of the videos that appear on the screen, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to be alerted about new videos. See you next time.